My wife, Chloe, left me on a rainy Tuesday morning because her mother told her I would never be more than a man who gets dirt under his fingernails. She didn't just leave, she took the $5.2 million custom estate in Seattle that I built with my own hands over 4 years of grueling labor. 6 months later, I was living in a basement studio that smelled like damp cardboard, staring at a stack of final notices. That was when a man in a charcoal suit knocked on my door, holding a locked briefcase and a message from the one person I thought hated me even more than my ex-wife did. When I saw what was inside that case, the air left my lungs so fast I thought I was having a heart attack. My life was about to flip upside down, but to understand why, I need to take you back to where the rot actually started. For over a decade, I believed I was building a legacy. My name is Julian and I'm a general contractor. I'm not a guy who sits in boardrooms or wears Italian loafers. I manage crews, I pour foundations, and I make sure a structure can survive a Category 4 hurricane. That was my pride. It was honest work that built a very comfortable life. When I met Chloe, I thought she was my anchor. She had this effortless elegance, the kind of woman who could command a room without raising her voice. I was head over heels from the second we met at a charity auction in downtown Bellevue. But there was always a shadow over us, her mother, Beatrice Sterling. From our very first meeting, Beatrice looked at me like I was a stain on her expensive rug. To her, I was just a laborer in work boots, a man whose hands were too rough for her daughter's social circle. She came from old money, status, and a family tree she treated like a holy relic. I remember a Christmas dinner at their place in Magnolia about 3 years into our marriage. I was excited, telling the table about a new sustainable housing project I'd just broken ground on. Chloe was smiling, but Beatrice just set her wine glass down with a clinical, cold click. She didn't even look at me. She looked right at Chloe and said, "It's charming that Julian plays with blocks, dear, but a man who spends his life hammering nails will never provide the prestige you were born for. You shouldn't waste your youth waiting for a common worker to become a gentleman." The table went silent. My blood turned to ice, but I just swallowed my pride and took a long drink of my scotch. I told myself it didn't matter what she thought as long as Chloe was on my side. At first, Chloe did stand up for me. We bought a plot of land overlooking the Puget Sound, and as my business took off, I poured every single dollar and every hour of overtime into building our sanctuary. By the time it was finished, it was a masterpiece: glass walls, reclaimed oak, and a view that could stop your heart. I thought that house was my shield. I thought it proved Beatrice was wrong. But I didn't realize that while I was out on job sites, Beatrice was spending every afternoon dripping poison into Chloe's ear. I started noticing the shift during the summer of 2024. Chloe began using her mother's vocabulary. She'd complain that I worked too many hours or ask why I couldn't be more like the hedge fund managers Beatrice invited to brunch. My mother, Martha, a retired schoolteacher who lives for her garden, saw the cracks before I did. She'd hold my hand and say, "Julian, you are a builder. Don't let that woman tear down your spirit." Even my younger brother, Leo, who works as a mechanic, warned me. He told me flat out, "She's not wearing your jersey anymore, man. She's listening to the coach in her ear, and that coach wants you off the field." I ignored it all because I loved her. I learned later that I was being watched, and a trap was being set that would cost me everything I had ever earned. I found out something that changed my entire perspective on the Sterling family, but I'll get to that in a moment. The day the process server showed up at the job site was a total blur. I went home and Chloe was standing in our designer kitchen, her bags already packed in the foyer. She didn't cry. She looked at me with a coldness I didn't recognize. She said, "My mother was right, Julian. You're just a dreamer who works in the mud. I need a life that actually goes somewhere." My knees hit the floor. I wanted to scream, to remind her that I built the very floor she was standing on, but the woman I loved was already gone. Walking out of that courthouse in downtown Seattle felt like watching my own funeral while I was still breathing. Beatrice Sterling sat in the front row, her chin tilted at an angle that screamed victory. Chloe didn't even look at me. Because of a prenuptial agreement her mother's lawyers had pressured us into signing years ago, and some aggressive accounting, I was stripped bare. The $5.2 million mansion I'd built on the coast? Gone. The BMW? Gone. Even my specialized tools were liquidated to pay for settlement fees. I was left with a 2012 Ford F-150 and enough cash to rent a windowless studio in a rough part of Tacoma. For the next 6 months, my life was a cycle of gray skies and stale coffee. I worked odd jobs, mostly repair work for people who didn't care about my portfolio. I was a failed dreamer, just like Beatrice said. The silence in that tiny apartment was deafening. I spent my nights staring at the peeling linoleum, wondering how a decade of marriage could be erased by a few months of whispering. I felt like I was disappearing. But then, on a Tuesday afternoon in late November, everything changed. I was sitting at my makeshift desk, an old crate, trying to figure out how to pay my electricity bill, when there was a firm rhythmic knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened it to find a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a high-end legal drama. He wore a navy blue overcoat and held a black leather briefcase with silver latches. "Julian Thorne?" he asked. His voice was like gravel on silk. Who's asking? I replied, crossing my arms to hide the fact that my hands were shaking from too much caffeine and not enough food. My name is Marcus Vance. I represent Arthur Sterling, he said. My heart skipped a beat. Arthur Sterling was Chloe's father. In the 12 years I was with Chloe, I'd barely spoken to the man. Arthur was a ghost in that family. He was a quiet, retired developer who spent most of his time at his private club or traveling. I always assumed he was just as cold as Beatrice, just quieter about it. I don't have anything left for the Sterlings to take, I said, reaching for the door handle. Marcus didn't flinch. Mr. Thorne, you misunderstand. Arthur isn't looking to take anything. He says he has something that belongs to you. Something he's been holding on to for a long time. He insists on seeing you immediately. He told me to tell you that this concerns the foundation of the empire. That phrase, the foundation of the empire, sent a chill down my spine. It was a term I'd used once, years ago, during a private conversation with Arthur about a land development project I was consulting on. I realized then that Arthur might have been paying more attention than I thought. Against every instinct I had to stay away from that family, I grabbed my worn Carhartt jacket. I needed to know if this was a new way to humiliate me, or if there was a crack in the Sterling's armor that I hadn't seen yet. We rode in a black Mercedes S-Class. The contrast was sickening. The smell of expensive leather and the quiet hum of the engine made my own life feel even smaller. We drove past the glittering skyscrapers of the city and turned toward a quiet, tree-lined estate in Queen Anne. This wasn't the massive mansion where Beatrice lived. This was a smaller, dignified brick house hidden behind a wall of ivy. As Marcus led me through the front door, the scent of old books and pipe tobacco hit me. It was a man's house, steady and silent. My pulse was hammering against my ribs. I was led into a dark-paneled study where Arthur Sterling sat by a fireplace. He looked older than I remembered, his hair now a shock of white, but his eyes were sharp, like he was looking right through the failed dreamer exterior and seeing the builder underneath. Julian, Arthur said, standing up slowly with the help of a silver-topped cane. I've been waiting for the right moment to fix a very large mistake. I stood there, frozen, as Arthur Sterling gestured toward a heavy leather chair across from his desk. I didn't sit down immediately. I looked at him, searching for the same smirk I'd seen on Beatrice's face at the courthouse, but I didn't find it. Arthur looked tired, maybe even a little ashamed. I finally sat, my muscles tense, feeling like a stray dog that had accidentally wandered into a palace. I know what happened in court, Julian, Arthur began, his voice low and steady. I know Beatrice used every legal loophole in the book to get you. I know she convinced Chloe that you were a liability to the Sterling name. I let out a sharp, bitter laugh. She didn't have to try very hard, Arthur. Chloe walked away without shedding a single tear. She took the house I built for our future and let her mother treat me like a common thief. Arthur leaned forward, resting his gnarled hands on the desk. Beatrice is a woman who values control above all else. She wanted a son-in-law she could puppet, and you were too independent. You were a builder, not a beggar. That's why she had to destroy you. But there's something Beatrice doesn't know. Something even Chloe doesn't know. He looked at Marcus Vance, the lawyer who was standing by the door. Marcus stepped forward and placed that black briefcase on the desk between us. My eyes locked onto the silver latches. I felt a surge of suspicion. Was this some kind of bribe to keep me away from Chloe? Or an NDA they wanted me to sign? I've spent 40 years in land development, Julian, Arthur continued. And I know a man of talent when I see one. About 7 years ago, when you were consulting on my North End project, I didn't just take your advice. I took your blueprints. I took your innovative structural designs and used them to secure a series of high-value developments across the Pacific Northwest. My throat went dry. I remembered that time. I was young, eager to please my father-in-law, and I'd spent months drafting revolutionary load-bearing designs that saved millions in material costs. I thought those ideas had just died in a filing cabinet somewhere. I never gave you the credit then because Beatrice insisted you were family and that your contributions were part of the marriage, Arthur said, his eyes darkening. But I realized that was a lie. I've been quietly setting aside a percentage of the equity from those projects into a private trust. I waited until the divorce was final. I waited until Beatrice thought she had taken everything from you so she wouldn't try to claim this too. Arthur reached out and clicked the latches. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. He lifted the lid and pushed the case toward me. I leaned in, my heart thumping against my ribs. I expected to see cash, but what I saw was much more powerful. Folders. Thick, legal folders filled with deeds, stock certificates, and ownership transfers. I picked up the top document. It was a deed for a massive commercial development in downtown Bellevue, a project I knew was worth hundreds of millions. At the bottom, in the Section 4 Managing Partner and 25% equity holder, my name was printed in bold, black letters. Julian Thorne. I flipped through the pages. It wasn't just one project. It was 5, 6, 7. These weren't scraps. This was a fortune. My hands started to shake. I looked up at Arthur, my voice barely a whisper. Why are you doing this now? You could have saved me months of living in that basement. You could have stopped the divorce. Arthur shook his head slowly. If I had stepped in during the marriage, Beatrice would have found a way to absorb this into Chloe's name. You would have still been under her thumb. No, Julian. You had to be free of them to truly own this. I saw how you handled the loss. You didn't beg. You didn't break. You went back to work with your hands. That's when I knew I was right about you. He paused, a faint, sad smile appearing on his face. But there's one more thing in that briefcase. Something that isn't about money. Look at the folder in the back. I reached for the slim, manila folder tucked behind the deeds. I pulled out a series of photographs and a ledger. As I scanned the first page, the room seemed to tilt. My chest tightened so hard I couldn't breathe. Everything I thought I knew about the night Chloe decided to leave me was a lie. I saw a name in that ledger. A name of a man Chloe had been seeing months before she ever mentioned divorce. A man Beatrice had handpicked. I looked at Arthur and he simply nodded. Now you have the truth, Julian. And now you have the power to decide what to do with it. I sat in Arthur's study for a long time, the ledger still gripped in my hands. The name staring back at me was Silas Vane, a high-level venture capitalist and a longtime friend of the Sterling family. According to the dates in the ledger, Chloe had been meeting him at a private club in Woodinville while I was still coming home covered in sawdust, thinking we were building a future. Beatrice hadn't just whispered poison, she had orchestrated a replacement. I'm not giving you this to make you miserable, Julian, Arthur said, his voice cutting through my shock. I'm giving you this because a man needs to know the ground he's standing on. You weren't a failure. You were an obstacle to a merger Beatrice wanted. Now the question is, are you going to stay in the mud or are you going to use what you've earned? I looked at the deeds in the briefcase. The value of the equity alone was enough to buy the mansion I'd lost 10 times over. But more than the money, it was the clarity. For 6 months, I had carried the shame of being not enough. Now I realized I had been too much for them to control. I stood up, closing the briefcase with a sharp snap. I'm going to build Arthur. And I'm going to make sure the Sterling name is the second most famous one in this city. I didn't waste a second. With Marcus Vance acting as my legal lead, I activated the trust. I didn't go buy a sports car or a penthouse. Instead, I rented a high-end office space in the heart of Seattle and rebranded my firm as Thorne Developments. I called back my old crew, men who had been laid off when the divorce gutted my business. When I told them we were back and that we had the backing of a major equity trust, the energy in the room was electric. Within 3 months, we broke ground on a luxury high-rise project that had been stalled for years. I was on the site every day at 5 a.m., but now I wasn't just the guy in the boots, I was the owner. My mother, Martha, came to the ribbon cutting for our new headquarters. She wore her best Sunday dress and hugged me so hard I could feel her shaking. I never doubted you, Julian, she whispered. The heart of a builder can't be stolen. Meanwhile, I started hearing whispers from the world I'd been kicked out of. The merger Beatrice wanted wasn't going as planned. Chloe and Silas Vane were the talk of the town, but the talk wasn't good. Rumors of Silas's gambling debts and a string of failed tech investments were starting to leak. The $5.2 million mansion I'd built, the one Chloe kept, was becoming a financial albatross. Without my income and my management of the maintenance crews, the sanctuary was starting to decay. One evening, I was leaving a late meeting at a restaurant in Bellevue called the Gilded Lily. As I waited for the valet, a black town car pulled up. The door opened and Beatrice Sterling stepped out. She looked as sharp as ever in her emerald silk suit, but when her eyes met mine, something changed. She didn't smirk this time. She looked at my tailored coat, then at the 2 assistants following me with blueprints. Julian, she said, her voice tight. I heard you found some investors. I suppose even a broken clock is right twice a day. I smiled, a genuine, calm smile. It wasn't luck, Beatrice. It was back pay. By the way, I heard the roof at the estate is leaking. You might want to get that checked. I hear the guy who built it is way out of your price range now. She turned pale, her mouth tightening into a thin line of rage as I stepped into my car. But as I drove away, I didn't feel the rush of revenge I expected. I felt something else, a strange sense of detachment. I saw something in my rearview mirror that night, a figure standing in the shadows of the restaurant entrance, watching me with an expression that looked a lot like regret. But I'll tell you who that was in just a moment. The figure standing in the shadows of the Gilded Lily wasn't Beatrice's driver. It was Chloe. She was wrapped in a designer coat that looked too heavy for her thin frame, and the look in her eyes wasn't the cold indifference I had seen in the kitchen 6 months ago. It was hesitation. I didn't stop my car. I had spent years chasing her approval, but that night, for the first time, I realized I didn't need it to breathe. By the 1-year anniversary of the divorce, Thorne Developments had become the primary contractor for the Green Sky initiative in Seattle. I was no longer just the guy fixing fences, I was the man shaping the skyline. I moved out of the basement and into a home I designed myself, not a sprawling mansion to impress Beatrice, but a masterpiece of stone and glass on the cliffs of Whidbey Island. My brother, Leo, finally quit the mechanic shop to head up my logistics department. My family was whole again, and the failed dreamer label had been incinerated by the reality of my success. While my world expanded, the Sterling Empire began to contract. Arthur had been right. Beatrice only cared about control, and without a worker, like me, to actually maintain the assets, her world was falling apart. I received a phone call in mid-January, on a night when the wind was whipping off the sound. It was Chloe. "Julian," she said, her voice trembling. I saw the news about the new waterfront project. Congratulations. Thank you, Chloe, I said, keeping my tone professional. Is there something you need? There was a long silence on the other end. The house, our house. I'm having to list it. Silas and my mother had some disagreements regarding the investments, and the bank is calling in the notes. Mother is saying it's your fault for hiding the trust assets during the settlement. I leaned back in my chair, looking at the blueprints of my next project. I didn't hide anything, Chloe. Your father gave me what I earned. If you had valued the man who built that house more than the status your mother promised, you'd still be sitting by that fireplace. But you chose the whisper over the work. Just when I thought the story was over, I discovered one final piece of the puzzle. I met Arthur for lunch at his club to thank him for his mentorship. He looked older, but there was a peace in his eyes. You did it, Julian, he said, sipping his tea. You proved that integrity is a stronger foundation than inheritance. I have one question, Arthur, I said, leaning in. Why did you really give me that ledger? The one with Silas Vane's name in it. Arthur looked at me with a sharp, piercing gaze. Because I wanted you to know that the betrayal wasn't about you, Julian. It was about them. Beatrice had been planning to replace you since the day you married her. She needed Silas because his family's firm held the debt on her properties. She traded her daughter's happiness for a balance sheet. I felt a cold shiver run through me. The betrayal went deeper than just a divorce. It was a business transaction where I was the collateral damage. But as I sat there, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. I had found the X in my story, the variable that changed everything. My X wasn't the money in the briefcase. It was the moment I stopped looking at myself through Beatrice's eyes and started looking through my own. A week later, I visited the old mansion one last time before the new owners took possession. Chloe was there, packing the last of her things into a modest SUV. Beatrice was nowhere to be found. I heard she had moved into a small condo in the city, her reputation in tatters. Chloe walked up to me on the driveway. The gravel crunched under her heels, the same gravel I had personally selected. "Do you hate me?" she asked. I looked at Chloe standing there on the driveway of the house that used to be our dream. She looked smaller somehow, stripped of the sterling armor that Beatrice had forced her to wear. "I don't hate you, Chloe," I said, and for the first time I realized I meant it. Hate is a heavy thing to carry, and I've spent the last year building things. I don't have room for it anymore. "I made a mistake," she whispered, her eyes welling up. "I let her convince me that you were the problem. I thought if I followed her plan, I'd finally be enough for her. But I lost the only person who actually saw me." I stayed silent. There was nothing left to fix here. I wasn't a failed dreamer anymore, and she wasn't the woman I had built this sanctuary for. I watched her drive away, the tires of her SUV kicking up the dust of a life that had finally turned to ash. I stood there for a long moment looking at the house. It was just wood, stone, and glass. The soul of it had left the day I did. The true turning point, the moment I found my X, wasn't when I opened Arthur's briefcase. It wasn't the millions of dollars or the deeds to the city's skyline. My point X happened in that dark, clanging apartment 6 months after the divorce. It was the moment I realized that Beatrice Sterling didn't have the power to define me unless I gave it to her. I had to be broken down to my very foundation to realize that I was the architect of my own worth. Today, Thorn Developments is more than a company. It's a testament to resilience. Arthur Sterling passed away peacefully a few months ago, leaving a legacy of integrity that I now carry forward. Beatrice and Chloe are names from a previous chapter, characters in a story about a man who had to lose everything to find himself. Every life finds its X. My X was the discovery that internal justice isn't about the world seeing you win. It's about you knowing you never lost your soul in the first place. I am Julian Thorn, and I didn't just survive the betrayal, I used the stones they threw at me to build something they could never reach. At Elfix Tales, we don't give advice or tell you how to feel. We tell stories that take pain to its ending, because every betrayal deserves closure. If Julian's journey from the mud to the skyline moved you, or if it reminded you of a time you had to rebuild your own life, please hit the like button and share this video. It helps these stories reach the people who need them most. What would you have done if you were in Julian's shoes? Would you have taken the briefcase or would you have walked away? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're looking for more journeys from betrayal to inner justice, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Your support keeps these stories alive. Until next time, keep building.